These have become therapy sessions. These have truly become therapy sessions for me personally, but I hope also for many of you that attend them. Oftentimes we feel very isolated in these very, very difficult times, and being in community is important. I know sitting on the internet and watching the horror unfold in front of us sometimes can be quite disturbing and demoralizing, and really kind of takes the wind out of your sail. But you see stuff, and you want to be able to come here and be in community with others. I know the other night, Sunday night, what's today? Today is Tuesday, right? 2 nights ago, Sunday night, we had a showing of the film No Other Land. How many of you got a chance to see it? So many of you have. Quite a disturbing film. We had the filmmaker here, Basil, who is from a village in the West Bank that's constantly under attack by the Israeli military and settlers, rogue settlers that go around just willy-nilly shooting at people and destroying their property and their livestock. And he was here sitting among us, having gone through like years of this. And I was thinking, you know, we're so stressed out just being here watching this, and he's like living it. And the courage that it takes for someone like him to be able to continue filming, continue to wake up every morning, continue to speak out, really is a inspiration, I think, for many of us to keep doing. When I walked away, I felt like I don't do enough, I need to do more. And I think that's the kind of connections that we need to make with one another so that we don't give up, because it's easy to do that during these very difficult times. So thank you for not giving up. Thank you for continuing to do what you do, and I'm sure all of you do incredible stuff. So we appreciate you. And I'm so excited to have our authors here, but I wanted to share just a couple of announcements. We have a lot of events that we're doing around Gaza, and many other topics, of course, as well. But one particularly interesting one that for some of you maybe is Norman Finkelstein will be back here on March 16. So if you'd like to attend that, I think it'll be a great event. A conversation with professor from Georgetown University, Nader Hashemi, who's a great interviewer, and he'll be interviewing Norman. Also, we started something that we thought was useful for people to be able to connect with each other on Sundays. So Sunday mornings, we started something called the Sunday School Cafe. And many of you probably have some experiences with Sunday schools at some level or another. This is a lot more interesting, I think, and more kind of in keeping with what's happening in the world today. So what we wanted to do is kind of take big topics and bring some really interesting, important people to discuss the topics with us. So we are students sitting like you're sitting now, and we have a professor or someone who is knowledgeable in the topic to be able to come and share their knowledge with us. It's strictly a lecture. There's Q&A at the end and some homework. Nobody's going to check it. You all get A's. So we started out with the first conversation was with Dr. Rashid Khalidi, and it was on Palestine. The second one was with Dr. Bassam Haddad on Syria. The third one we did was with Dr. Peter Kuznick on Russia. Last weekend we had one on Iran with Negar Murtazani. And then the coming one on Sunday is again with Dr. Nader Hashemi. It's on political Islam. It's on Sunday. It'll be the second day Ramadan. So we thought it'd be interesting to do that, be able to share some information about Islam to folks that seem a little confused about it or not. Anyway, so here we are with this conversation. Yes? So thank you for asking. Good student. What time is Sunday school? It's 9 to 11. 9 to 11 in the morning, and we hand out stickers.
He's not kidding.
The extra selling point.
You get points.
I think that tipped it for Omar.
You get
The
points just for
stickers.
showing up.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Everybody gets a sticker. If you show up, you get a sticker. Anyway, so today we're here. We're going to have an okay time here. But today we have here with us Phyllis Bennis and Omar Baddar. We are going to be having a conversation about Phyllis's new book with a foreword by Omar. The book, which I don't know who did the title, but it's hard to read. It's called Understanding Palestine and Israel, with the foreword by Omar Baddar. If you'd like to purchase the book, it's available here. Please buy it from here and don't go to Amazon and buy it, because we like to sell our books here rather than Amazon. So thank you. Yes, applause, please. So let me introduce them to you first, and then we can have the conversation. I know a lot of you know these folks very well, but just briefly. Phyllis Bennis is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She co-directs the New Internationalism Project. She serves as an international advisor for Jewish Voice for Peace. She has traveled to Palestine and speaks regularly on many news and YouTube outlets and writes extensively on Israel-Palestine conflict. She was also shortlisted as the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, a position that's held by Francesca Albanese right now. And she does a marvelous job too, but I hope Phyllis gets there next. And Omar Baddar is he's a political analyst, human rights advocate based here in Washington, D.C. He's former executive director of Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts and a former director of the Palestine Cultural Center for Peace in Boston, Massachusetts as well. He has appeared on several media outlets, writes extensively on the topic of Israel and Palestine. Welcome, both of you. It's nice to have you. So I know, Phyllis, I'll start with you. I know you probably fretted over the title of the book. And when you think about understanding, you're assuming that people don't. Do you feel at this point people still need to understand what's happening there, or is it just so obvious that people should just get it?
Thanks, Andy. I never start from the vantage point of people should just get it, because we don't live in a world where getting it is easy. We live in a world where not getting it is way easier. And that goes for the media, that goes for education, that goes starting in kindergarten and right up through university, where assumptions about other parts of the world, and it's not only around Palestine, Israel, but that's certainly one of the most overt examples of this kind of misinformation that we get growing up in this country. You know, I remember when I was in high school, I was in a international relations class. And it was supposed to be an honors class. It was supposed to be the quote, smart kids. And at the beginning of the class, the teacher said, you all need to start thinking about what country you want to write about, because you're going to have to write a big report at the end of the semester, and you can write about whatever country you want, but only one person is going to do each country. And everybody's waving their hands, I want to do Israel, I want to do Israel. And probably, I don't know, maybe a quarter or fewer of the kids in the class were Jewish. It wasn't about that. It was every kid in the class, black kids, white kids, knew more about Israel than any other country, because we had learned about it from kindergarten. I didn't get to do Israel. I was very disappointed. But, you know...
What country did you do?
I really don't remember. It seems to me it might have been Cameroon, but I'm not quite sure. I don't think I did I don't think I did a very good report thinking about it. But you know, what we're talking about, I think, for me, looking at the need for this book and the urgency of it, because I've done books before, we've talked about them here, these primers that are sort of done as FAQs, and they're kind of, you know, guidebooks to different political issues. But we were in a different moment because of the genocide in Gaza. And there were two aspects that, for me, were really the important components that led me to think, okay, I really have to do a new book about this. One was about the question of when you start the clock. because what we were hearing over and over again was history started on October 7th, 2023. And look what happened. And a lot of people who I would have expected differently kind of lost their political bearings and thought, because it was something that hadn't happened in that region at that time against Israel, it was something that was quite different. But the notion that it had no history, that it didn't come out of what had happened 17 years earlier when Israel imposed a full blockade on the Gaza Strip and decided how many calories would be allowed into the Strip each day so that people would be hungry but they wouldn't starve. They actually calculated it down to the calories. When that began, and so of course there was also not sufficient water, all those things. Or maybe from 55 years earlier when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip. And you had, as a result, a population of refugees who had been driven out of their homes 75 years before. In 1948, 80% of the population of Gaza were refugees from what is now southern Israel. And the notion that what happened on October 7th somehow had nothing to do with any of that was not surprising to me, but it was shocking. It was shocking to see it. And so that was a big part of it. And then the question was, well, who is this book for? I mean, who are you writing for? And I think I had kind of two groupings in mind. One was the people who had, within weeks, days in many cases, come out into the streets as the attacks on Gaza took shape, as it moved towards becoming a clear genocide. People came out into the streets who had never really paid attention to Israel and Palestine before, who weren't that committed at all, who didn't define themselves as internationalists, didn't define themselves as activists necessarily, but they were human beings who were seeing this. For the first time, a genocide was taking place on our screens in front of us. That had never happened before. And people responded in this extraordinary human way, demanding a ceasefire. And so we had, alongside the long-standing movement for Palestinian rights that the three of us and many people here have been part of for so long, we now had this new movement that was quite different, the movement for ceasefire. And we can talk later about that movement and why I say it was different than the Palestinian rights movement, but it was a different set of people. And then the other was these incredible students, the students who made this issue their own, who built these incredible encampments on campuses around this country. And they did teach-ins, and they did prayer services, and they did Passover Seders when Passover came. They were incredible. And the students were what gave it a whole new kind of life in this movement. And yet, a lot of the students had never had the opportunity, had never had the time to study the issue, to learn some of the history. So I had them in mind, too. So, you know, I'm hoping it'll be useful for those people and lots of other people who are maybe not going to read the whole book, but look at it and say, God, I always wondered about X. And you can go to that question and see X, and then not read the rest for a while, you know. You don't have to read the whole thing.
I want to turn to you, Omar, a little bit. You've been doing this work for some time on Palestine, and have you seen a major shift in the understanding of this issue now than before? Do you feel like it's more about people that have already been converted are just learning more about it, or do you feel like there's actually a new set of folks coming into it, saying, you know what, I was in a whole different paradigm and now I see it differently?
Thank you, Andy. I would be remiss not to start, given the reason why we're here and for this book coming out, not to mention the fact that when I felt very strongly growing up and coming to this country as a teenager and feeling like there's a story to be told about Palestine, looking for ways to convey the most important information about it in a way that is digestible to an American audience, that Phyllis was one of very few people that I've learned a lot from in terms of how to make that much easier to understand. So really the title of the book actually is pretty fitting if you want to gain a much better understanding in a way that is not particularly complicated, and just you get the nuances. I think this is really an incredible way to do it. So I really appreciate the work that you've done for many, many years doing that. In terms of the audience and sort of like public understanding of this issue, I think there has been a significant shift. But over many, many years of the movement for Palestinian rights in this country, doing incredible work to try to break through the mainstream media's propaganda on this issue, our establishment political discourse on it being as toxic as it is. We have done incredible work shifting that discourse. And I think that what we've seen also since, over the past 17 months or so, a big shift in the way that people consume this information. That when you look at people who are 40 and younger, who primarily consume social media and the internet as their way of understanding what is actually unfolding, there is no surprise at the fact that people have turned out in the way that they have on college campuses and everywhere else, demanding an end to this horror. But there still remains that older generation that still relies on legacy media, that still believes what politicians say, unfortunately. And there's been nothing more absurd to me than the extent to which our political representation in this country parrots whatever Israeli officials say without question. And it doesn't matter how many lies the Israeli government is caught telling over and over and over again. The complete lack of credibility that just the suspicion that a basic elementary common sense and critical thinking, any person with those would just look at that pattern of lies and disinformation and would just conclude that maybe, just maybe, we should wait for verification or wait for neutral sources and see what human rights organizations might say instead of taking all that at face value. You don't see any of that questioning almost anywhere, barring a handful of people who on occasion dare to question the official narrative in terms of mainstream media is concerned. And so you still do have a generation and a political establishment that continues supporting Israel no matter what it does. The promise is in that shifting public opinion among younger people. It tells us where we're heading and the fact that it's promising that we're heading towards a significant change. But the horror lies in the fact that for the foreseeable future, the people who hold the levers of power in this country continue to look at this issue from an extremely biased perspective, continue to default into viewing Israelis as human beings and Palestinians as kind of this alien other whose rights don't matter. And that means that for the foreseeable future, for the coming few years at least, we are stuck in a horrifying dynamic in which, while Israel is seeing this shift in discourse and realizing that the window of opportunity that they have is closing and their time is limited in terms of what they can do, that is a huge part for why Israel is accelerating its genocide. They feel like they don't know how much longer they're going to have US support for. But in the meantime, for the time that they do have it, they're going to carry out everything in their power in order to eliminate Palestinians from existence, in order to end the Palestinian struggle for freedom and justice and equality. And that means that these horrors are almost certainly going to escalate, certainly the Trump years. Mm-hmm. And that is deeply disturbing in spite of the fact that people are gaining a better understanding of this issue and things look promising a little bit down the road.
There's a lot in the book, obviously, on background, and I'm going to kind of skip over that and bring it more to what's happening today, because I think for a lot of the people in this room, first of all, we want you to buy the book, so we're not going to go through all of it. But we want to also be able to talk about, where are we today, and what can we do other than understanding the Palestinian and Israeli conflict? Really, what can we do as a community? What is missing that is still needs to be targeted or focused on in order for, like you said, does it have to get worse before it's going to get better? And this is really to both of you. You want to start, Phyllis? Is it a matter of just more learning that needs to happen, or is it a matter of there is something structurally problematic here and learning isn't going to change that?
Yes. That's the starting point. Yes, a lot more learning is necessary.
Why the hell do you write this book?
I don't know. But I think, one of the challenges with, somebody asked me this morning, are you really excited about launching the book tonight? And I said, yeah. And I realized I didn't feel as excited as I wished I did on some level, because if this book is successful at reaching people who maybe for the first time in the last 16 months has taken seriously the need to understand what's going on in that part of the world and the role of our government, our tax dollars, our name in making that happen, it's going to be that's kind of the initial part, but that's right now, and the conditions on the ground aren't going to change right now. This is medium term and long term when we're talking about the education. It's also true that there are structural challenges here that make sort of generalized protest not enough. We saw in these 16 months some of the most creative protests, national, local, statewide, global, all kinds of protests, occupying offices in Congress, the Jewish Voice for Peace taking over the Grand Central Station, rabbis occupying the Security Council chamber at the UN, Muslims praying outside of the Capitol. Everybody was out there. You know, one day it was this group, one day it was the next group, the next day it was everybody together. And one of the things that was extraordinary was seeing how this movement that we both spoke of, really, the movement for ceasefire, which is not made up primarily of people who have been working on Palestinian rights forever, and you know, it's people who are coming to it for the first time. They managed to do two things that the Palestinian rights movement was never very good at. One was message discipline. Our movement is not a very disciplined movement. People talk about all kinds of things all the time, and sometimes they contradict each other, and people get in trouble for it. It's like, it's a messy movement. This movement, not so much. This movement was really disciplined. The demand was ceasefire now. And if you ask people, it means a permanent ceasefire. And within a few months, that definition had itself expanded. So that now a ceasefire meant not only actually stop dropping bombs, stop the drone attacks, stop the tank attacks. That's number one. Number two is we need massive amounts of humanitarian aid to be allowed in, unlimited amounts. Truckload after truckload, hundreds and hundreds every day. Medical care, health, water, food, all those things. That was part of what a ceasefire means. And then third, and finally, and most important, it also meant stop sending weapons. So the demand stayed the same. The demand was ceasefire. But what people understood that to mean became far broader. And I thought that was an extraordinary thing to see. I hadn't seen that before in movements that could simultaneously, at a kind of spontaneous level, people were picking this up from all kinds of places, keep to the discipline level. You know, we were not talking mostly about settler colonialism and ending imperialism or even ending apartheid. Most of the time, this was about a ceasefire because genocide is different. The oppression that is reflected by genocide is different than other kinds of oppression that we have fought for many years, and people recognize that. So I think that was an extraordinary thing to see, but with all of the excitement in the protests, all of the creativity in the protests, different tactics all the time, it still wasn't enough. We were not able to stop to get a different policy. We did get a different discourse. We saw it in the White House. And it happened with the emergence of the uncommitted movement in the spring and summer of 2023, in the run-ups to the 2024 election. In the spring and summer of 2024, in the run-up to the election, you had people all over the country saying, this choice between somebody who is representing fascism and somebody who is defending genocide is not an okay choice. And in these primary elections, I am going to say no. I'm going to stay uncommitted to either of those sides. That was unprecedented. And it had an extraordinary impact that, among other things, led to a change of the discourse right in the White House. So for the first time, since that early November, very tentative one-week process, the word ceasefire came out of the mouths of Biden and Harris. We hadn't heard the word before that. The problem was they weren't willing to fight for it, to make it happen. The one thing that had to happen was to stop the arms, and they refused to do that. So it wasn't a real commitment, but we did see the impact of that set of protests when they thought that the election itself was at risk, that they might lose, which is in fact, as we saw, what happened. And 29% of the people who voted for Biden in 2020 and stayed home in 2024, 29% of those people said their first most important reason, not the only reason, but the most important reason was Gaza.
Oh, Omar, I want to turn to you because Phyllis brought it all the way to the election, and I wanted a lot of Arab Americans, said, I'm not voting for genocide, therefore I'm not voting for Harris. And now there's a lot of people saying, well, you happy now? Are you happy with what you got? And that's obviously a problem to address because it created a division, certainly within the progressive movement. People that cared about the environment, that cared about women's rights, that cared about Black Lives Matter and all these things felt, not necessarily rightfully so, I'm not saying, but felt betrayed by their Arab brothers and sisters who were so intent on this one issue, which was genocide. How do you navigate that, and how do we come back together as a unified, movement, really? Because if we continue to act within our silos, obviously, white supremacy and fascism will prevail.
Yeah.
How do you counter the results of the election and bring people together?
No, I'll say that the entire discourse leading up to the election was frankly excruciating. I personally have always sort of had the Chomskyan attitude of lesser of two evils on election day is really important. It's ultimately about reducing harm. And on that one day, when you can influence who your opponent is going to be in the White House, you pick the opponent that will cause a little bit less harm, that's going to be a little bit easier to some extent to push to get something positive out of them in some progressive direction. But genocide felt like a line to me that was different, qualitatively different, that if you're thinking exclusively in terms of harm reduction, I have no doubt that Trump is significantly worse on a lot of other issues, primarily domestic issues. But Trump would not be able to say what he's saying today about Gaza being unlivable and wanting to ethnically cleanse Palestinians out of it on those grounds had it not been for what the Biden-Harris administration has done for many, many months before. So on Gaza specifically, Trump's horrific rhetoric about ethnic cleansing is built on the genocide that Biden and Harris have funded. There's no question about it. And even though I understand some of the frustration that was directed at frankly, it wasn't just the Arab American and American Muslim communities, it was far beyond that, of people who could not bring themselves. The numbers that Phyllis had just mentioned are huge, of just everyday Americans of all walks of life who could not bring themselves to give a pass to the Democrats on their position on this. And for me, the question should not be posed towards the people who had to watch literally their loved ones get shredded day in and day out, month after month. That question should have been directed at the Democratic Party leadership, who have been warned repeatedly that the inevitable outcome of this is that you are risking bringing a fascist to take control of the country if you don't fix your policy on this. It was morally required that they oppose genocide. It was strategically in the US's favor, internationally, for them to do so. And it was electorally smart for them to have done it for domestic purposes. And the fact that the Democrats were so tone deaf at that moment and so blind to what their base desperately wanted, I think that there's no way but to blame the Democratic Party leadership for that. And what's even more disappointing is that they don't seem to be open to learning that lesson until this day. That's the horror. The rewriting of history on this is deeply disturbing, that right now you see a lot of the media discourse on it. The lesson is the Democrats were too far to the left and listened to progressives too much. And what are you talking about? I mean, the entire Harris campaign ran away from any domestic achievements for progressives by the Biden administration, alienated the base on so many different things, was trying to appeal to Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney. They were holding them up as evidence of how great and centrist and wonderful they are. They ran a centrist campaign that tried to appeal to the right and ignored the Democratic and progressive base, and there's no surprise that they lost that election. So as much as I appreciate that frustration, I think it's extremely misguided to direct it at people whose loved ones were being massacred in a genocide instead of directing it at the people who should have been paying closer attention. And I think that battle still needs to be fought until this day, because there's going to be future elections. And we have to make sure that the correct information is conveyed about it so that actual lessons are learned from it, and we can start moving things in a better direction instead of relying on the same consulting class in DC that just gives the same bored, old, tired talking points to these politicians who repeat that mean nothing, and people can see through it. That's the last thing I want to highlight on this, is even though Trump is just a horrible human being through and through, with hardly any redeeming qualities, frankly, he sounded authentic in a way the Democrats could not bring themselves to sound authentic. When Trump talks, it's Trump talking, but when the Democrats speak, you can tell it's whatever talking points were fed to them by consultants, and it does not sound authentic. They don't speak to people. And you have to fix those two things. Fix yourself on the policies themselves and start listening to people and listening to their concerns and fighting for the people of this country. And on top of that, stop listening to the consulting class that tells you to speak in a certain way that is the reason why we have so little political participation in this country, because politics seem phony, and we can do better. We can do better.
I want to go to October 7th a little bit here and ask you, Phyllis. This was a moment that I think quite paradigm-shifting moment, certainly. How do you think history will look at this moment, let's say, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What is your thoughts about the impact of what October 7th did and the aftermath of that?
You know, what I said earlier about how we understand history starts with when you start the clock, I think is really true. I also think it's true about where your history takes place. So I think what people in this country are going to hear in 5 years is probably not different enough from what we are hearing right now. In much, not all, but much of the rest of the world, I think there is already a very different understanding. The events of October 7th were horrific at a human level for a whole bunch of different people. Some of it was absolute violation of international law. Some of it was not, because international law is very clear that people living under military occupation have the right to use military force to destroy that occupation. And they don't have the right to use military force against civilians. Both those things are true. We never heard that kind of nuance, and still really don't hear it anywhere. All we hear is that it was a horror, which at the human level, of course it was. What we heard was made worse by a series of false claims that were made about things that happened that never happened, that were just made up, and were rather quickly debunked. It didn't take very long. But despite that, they were repeated over and over. One of the things I quote in the book is when Biden made the claim, I won't even mention here what it was, one of the horrific claims of something that allegedly happened on October 7th, which of course did not happen and had already been long debunked. And his staff told him, don't say that, it's not true. And he went out and said it anyway. And later when they were asked, why did he say that? Didn't he know it wasn't true? And they said, well, he said it because he wanted to emphasize how terrible the events of October 7th were. So it was like, well, if they were that terrible, why did he have to state false claims? You know, and it's because that was part of
And those claims continue to be repeated
They
by
continue
members
to
of
be-
Congress.
yes.
I mean, I watch Medea
Yes.
Benjamin walk around, they repeat the exact same talking words.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, as the words that
Right.
you mentioned.
Right. This is this is the post-fact era, as we're being told. And one aspect of that is that when false statements, false claims are debunked, it doesn't matter. As long as it's in somewhere, it's in a book, it's in the newspaper, it's in the internet somewhere. You can point to it and say, oh, well, that happened. It's in the internet. I read it online. It's like, oh, and you believe everything you believe online? It's like, apparently you do. So I think the question of how people come to understand it is going to be very different. I think that one of the things that's so important here is part of the response to the genocide that was Israel's answer to October 7th has had a very different set of responses around the world. And one of them, the one that I've been very involved with and other people here have as well, is the South African initiative at the International Court of Justice. And even before you get to the details of what that case is all about, the fact that the government of South Africa took up the challenge that had never been challenged before to say that the institutions that grew out of the post-World War II era that were designed not just as victor's justice, but at the end of the day, these were institutions, whether we're talking about the UN, particularly the Security Council, whether we're talking about later the International Court of Criminal Court, which is not officially part of the same thing, but reflects the same ethos, the International Court of Justice. These were institutions that were designed to be used by the white colonial powers of the world, right? And here you had an African country that had had its own struggles for generations against apartheid. Now the Rainbow Nation is the one that takes it up and says, we don't think so. We think that we have as much right as every other country in this world to use the institutions that have been created in the name of the world to say this is not okay, and to say we're not only going to use it in some abstract way, we're going to use it to bring to justice the closest ally of the most powerful country that has ever existed in this world. The wealthiest, the most militaristic, and the most able to use its military with the greatest amount of force. And we're going to do that, and we're going to not only survive, we're going to emerge as heroes in the world. That's one of the extraordinary things. On the day that the South African team in The Hague went to make their argument, there were people around the world who were getting up. We got up here at 4 o'clock in the morning. How many people here got up at 4 in the morning to watch the hearings? Few, okay, a few. But there were people everywhere who did that, who got up, and there were texts flying back and forth around the world. I got a text from a friend of mine in South Africa who was watching it at the same time saying, I have never been so proud to be a South African, and I've never been so proud to be a human being. It was an amazing moment. And that wasn't because we all thought this was going to result instantly in an end to the genocide and Netanyahu goes to jail and everybody lives happily ever after. Nobody was that filled with illusion. But the notion that there could be a challenge that could say, yes, Israel does not have the right to be immune from accountability, that impunity can end, and that people, civil society, social movements can play a role in this. That was one of the amazing things about the South African team, the degree that they worked with Palestinian civil society, with South African civil society, with civil society from other places as well. That was what was so extraordinary about this. So most people around the world, when you say October 7th, 5 years from now, they're going to say, oh yeah, isn't that when that case in the International Court of Justice proved that people can do stuff that the US and Israel can't stop? That's going to be the difference. Here in this country, maybe not, but in the rest of the world, yeah.
I actually had a very vivid dream a couple months ago with Netanyahu in handcuffs. It was really a really cool, and I woke up really believing it happened. It was that vivid, but you know, maybe it did happen. I don't know. But
In the future, hopefully.
exactly, I want to stick with that. the keffiyeh that I'm wearing is actually a South African keffiyeh that was made in a village near Hebron. So it was given to me by a Lebanese friend, actually, who got it from somewhere. Anyway.
The South African colors.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, the impact of South Africa is spreading far and wide. Yeah, I want to turn back to you, Omar, about some of the proposals that are being put forward. With you said, you know, about Trump speaks his mind. He certainly does, and sometimes his mind is pretty weird. And so he's speaking of ethnic cleansing. I think he may have even said the words, almost to that level, where moving all Palestinians in Gaza out, turning Palestine or Gaza into a Riviera, and you know, and they're not going to come back because they're going to have such a great life wherever they are. Can you speak to that? What do you think? What is, first of all, what is the pulse of people in Gaza at this point, if you have any insight on that? And where do you think that idea, how far do you think that idea is actually going to be brought about?
It's funny, the level of arrogance and bluster that Trump displayed in making those comments. He, in addition to saying ethnically cleanse Gaza, he said, we're going to own it and no one is going to question it. Those were the actual words that came out of his mouth when he was talking about it. I mean, just the level of detachment from reality that you can have to say no one is going to question it. It's just, it's really difficult to put into words, the absurdity of it. And what made it all the more distasteful is that he painted it as concern for Palestinians. The reason we have to do this is because life in Gaza is so terrible, we have to find somewhere else for them to live. And the first time he made that proposal, he was standing across the podium from the man who was responsible for making Gaza unlivable. Across from Netanyahu, who's smirking at the next podium, speaking about Gaza as if it's a natural disaster, instead of the massacre that he and his predecessor have armed and funded. And it's easy to dismiss, right? Like, my initial instinct is that'll never happen. Palestinians do not want to leave their homes. We've seen Israel over and over and over again trying to drive Palestinians out of existence, and they have failed every single time. Of course, they've succeeded in ethnically cleansing a lot of Palestinians, but at the end of the day, that dream of wiping Palestinians off of the land entirely has failed over and over again. And so what I want to say is keep dreaming, and that'll never happen, and to feel good about that. But honestly, I'm reflecting on what it would take to complete the job, quote unquote. The part where the US sends in troops on the ground to move Palestinians out of Gaza, like, that's never gonna happen. So we're fine, we know that much is a fantasy. But if they just maintain the siege on Gaza, having destroyed it entirely, having utterly obliterated the health infrastructure, the water infrastructure, no housing anywhere, just Gaza's ability to sustain human life right now is practically evaporated. And so a world that has allowed the genocide to unfold month after month for 16 months straight before the ceasefire took effect, all I kept thinking the entire time is there's no way, how much longer is the world going to let this happen? Surely somebody's going to step up and step in and say enough is enough. And what I worry about now, having watched that heartbreak and disappointment week after week, month after month, is if Israel does decide to continue the genocide and does prevent anything from coming into Gaza, what is the practical implication and who is going to stop it? And my inability to answer the question of who's going to stop it is what worries me. I don't envision any massive military operation to physically remove Palestinians out of Gaza, but I imagine an Israeli determination to continue a massacre on unspeakable proportions in the way that we have witnessed, and a refusal for anybody in the world to intervene to make sure that Palestinians can sustain life in Gaza. And that, I think, is a very, very dark vision, and seems to be one that Netanyahu is still committed to, as we've seen with the dumping of leaflets all over Gaza pretty recently, saying that displacement is imminent, and with the fact that Trump is completely out of his mind and has absolutely no qualms about supporting the most monstrous policies imaginable. That's my source of worry.
Can I just jump in with something? I think what you were just saying is so incredibly important. And I want to point to
And disturbing.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it's important and it's real. In 2012, there was a group of UN agencies that deal with humanitarian conditions around healthcare, around children, around a host of things, who did a joint report to the United Nations and said that by the year 2020, 8 years from then, that Gaza would be, in their words, unlivable. And it was taken very seriously, and there were responses, and it was like, oh, we have to do something about this. Nothing was done. In 2018, they announced that Gaza was close to unlivable. By that time, Gaza had gone through 4 iterations of assaults, air raids, destruction of infrastructure, rebuilt by the Europeans, destroyed again. And no one felt the need to deal with the reality of what this means. At the same time, you have a new kind of reality where 2 things are happening at the same time. The discourse in this country has changed enough. So the New York Times yesterday had an article, I forget who wrote it, that talked about what Trump wants to do and how no one really knows what Trump wants to do, because he has called for a permanent ceasefire, he's called for permanent war, and he's called for ethnic cleansing. I don't think the New York Times had ever used the term ethnic cleansing, except maybe in a historical sense or something, but never used it as a description of what a U.S. president is calling for. Here it was taken as a matter of course. This is what the U.S. president wants, is ethnic cleansing, according to the New York Times. And that was completely normalized. So it says something about how the discourse is shifting, because people have demanded that we be honest about what is happening, but it has not changed, it has not gone to the level of policy. And the other side of it is, Trump has taken this position that, well, the Palestinians will just go to Jordan and Egypt. And the Jordanian and Egyptian leaders have all said, we don't think so, we don't want these people. We don't want it because it's a challenge to us, because our population wants to support Palestinians who don't want to be physically, ethnically cleansed again, made refugees again. And so we heard from the president of Egypt, who is of course completely dependent on US funding and US arms, that there's no way we're going to take in 2 million Palestinians. And I want to say, yeah, but would you maybe take in 200,000? I'm thinking, yeah, maybe he would. And maybe the king of Jordan, who also has a lot to worry about in terms of his own support from the United States. And he has a bit more support than the president of Egypt, but not that much. Both of them have to worry about instability in their own countries. And is he now going to say, well, we're not going to take 2 million people, but a couple 100,000 more? Yeah, maybe. I don't think we can assume that that will not happen. If they are offered enough money, enough new arms, and our country is very good at giving money and arms, despite the attacks on USAID. They're not attacking the Pentagon that way. The way they're attacking the Pentagon has nothing to do with it. So I think that we have to be very clear-eyed as we look at this. When you say, Omar, we know this is not going to happen, I tend to think you're right. I'm not sure I'd bet the store if I had a store. I'm not sure I'd bet the store on that. But I think you're probably right. But I don't think we can assume that this position that, well, the Arab governments are never going to allow this. Yeah, they might, because they don't care about the Palestinians. They care about the danger they could be overthrown, but that's a different question. So I think we're in for a very, very challenging way of dealing with this horror that we're seeing still playing out. I was just reading today, I just got I wanted to get the numbers right on this new $8.5 billion worth of weapons that the administration has just asked for, that has just approved. Senator Sanders, of course, is asking for a joint resolution of disapproval. The last time we tried that, we got 19 votes, which sounds like not very much, but it was actually 40% of all the Democrats in the Senate voted for that. That was unprecedented, but it wasn't enough to stop it. And here, they want to spend $6.7 billion worth of buying new bombs, including 2,800 of those 500-pound bombs that are so effective in areas like Gaza, Hellfire missiles, artillery shells. This is now today. This is not what they were doing 6 months ago when the genocide was at its height. This is what they're trying to get now. And these are not the ones that they're looking for to go after Iran. Those will come later. These are for Gaza and maybe Lebanon, but mostly Gaza. So that's what we're looking at today. As we look at what the changes have been in the discourse, the changes in public understanding have been huge, and they have not been enough. So we need new tactics, we need new creativity, and we're still working to make that happen.
And the handful of voices that are still on television, certainly on cable TV, are getting fired as we speak. So that they're losing that we're losing that end of it. One of the cruelest thing I thought about those flyers they were dropping is about how, they told, and nobody cares about you, and the Arab countries have all sold you out for military assistance and a little bit of money. They actually wrote that in there, and so it was really eerie and disturbing, and certainly made your skin crawl. It was pretty awful. And now we're seeing, of course, tanks moving into the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, and so what do you think that's a prelude for? I mean, it's feeling to me like they're trying to transfer Gaza, maybe the leftovers from Gaza, to the West Bank at this point as a possibility, and get that kind of.
If I can just jump into that, I actually don't think that's likely, because the West Bank is the ideological center of the far right in Israel. They don't care about Gaza. Gaza was not part of so-called Greater Israel. There's no claim that God gave us Gaza. The claim is God gave us the West Bank and Jerusalem and what is now the rest of Israel. So Gaza is a bother, and the Gazans are in the way of making it a Riviera, in the way of making it beach real estate.
I think Israeli politicians have talked about cutting off Gaza and throwing it into the sea, wishing
Yes,
they could. That's
wishing they could, exactly. It's not the same as the West Bank, where the key is, how do we control the land? Getting what we're seeing right now in the West Bank, a major escalation that's been underway, particularly since the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th.
With 200,000 maybe going to Egypt, 200,000 maybe into that still leaves 1.5 million people.
Right.
What's going to happen to those 1.5 million people at this point? Are they just going to be just obliterated, killed? Is that and if that happens, are people going to go on the street and go insane here? Is that going to happen?
The thing you mentioned about the leaflets and talking about nobody cares about you anymore. Sort of the biggest obstacle that Israel has run into, they have the military advantage, they have the financial advantage, they've got the backing of the most powerful countries in the world. The thing they kept running into is the Palestinian will to exist and resist. And that is what is intended by these leaflets. That's the one thing they have not been able to break, and they are desperate to break it. And I think what they're hoping for is, quote unquote, the natural death of Palestinians in Gaza to some extent. When you look at life expectancy in Gaza, it's sinking. When you look at the fact that people die from all kinds of preventable causes at massive rates right now because there is no infrastructure, I imagine that is the vision that Israel has for Gaza. It is not fit for human life. You can stay and die, or you can desperately try to get out, and if you want to get out, we'll help you. They use this disgusting term of voluntary migration, or whatever it is.
And offering money for it.
Yeah.
How much?
I don't know how much, but they're offering to pay for anyone who wants to leave and can get a visa. The Israeli government will pay, they'll buy plane fares, they'll do all that. They want people out. They want them to stop being a problem. They would love to do that in the West Bank as well. The problem is the West Bank infrastructure is at an entirely different level that makes that virtually impossible because of the intersection of the settlements.
I was thinking of a weird metaphor. I think the airline that flipped upside down is offering everybody $30,000. You know, and it's like the world turned upside down, and so the world of Palestinians turned upside down. Are they going to offer them $30,000 each or whatever? So I'm trying to figure out what would that look like. Like what would, you know, I mean, I put myself in the shoe of a Palestinian. If somebody said, "Would you like me to kill your family, or would you like to get out?" Obviously,
People with children are faced with a whole different set of
absolutely.
considerations, for sure. And one of the big problems has been that until the ceasefire went into effect, people could not get out.
Yes, yeah.
People who were desperately trying, who had kids with cancer, who they weren't being bombed at that moment, but they were dying of cancer because there's no cancer treatment in Gaza. And
they had
they
to pay
couldn't get out.
thousands of dollars to get out.
Right, but they couldn't
Yeah.
get out, most of them, through the Egyptian crossing because the Israelis had taken it over in May. So since May, nobody was able to get out until this last period in January. But the question then becomes, if they can convince enough countries, whether it's Australia, whether it's some countries in Africa, who knows which countries, Fiji might be open, all these countries that have been willing to take, like Palau, the US bribed the government there to take refugees from Australia who are kept in a refugee camp, a giant refugee camp on one of the islands outside of Palau. Will countries agree to that if they're given a whole lot of money? I'm betting yes, because governments of most countries are no better than most of the governments we know in terms of their willingness to be bribed. And when the bribe is, take in a bunch of refugees, we don't really care how you treat them. We're not going to be watching very closely. Don't worry about that. The UN will yell and scream a little bit, but don't worry about that. And if you can keep your own population happy, that's the other part. The most important part is what Omar just said about Palestinian will to exist. Samud, the resilience of Palestinians that is so extraordinary. And what's different now is that there's also this global mobilization, that the connection to Palestine exists among so many more people than it ever did before. So that the Black freedom movement across the United States is integrally connected to the question of Palestinian rights. The movements across Europe are taking up the demand for Palestinian rights. Across Africa, this is now a demand. It's not just coming from Algeria or something. This is now a global phenomenon that we have never seen before. And it's not, we can't really claim this as the work of the long-standing Palestinian rights movement around the world. It's a new version of that. It's spontaneous, and it's a human response to something that the world has never seen, which is watching a genocide unfold in real time in front of our eyes. And the knowledge that our government is not just standing back and not helping, but is paying for the weapons, is selling the weapons, is giving the weapons, is training them in how to use the weapons, and then is paying them off to make sure that they have enough money to keep doing it.
If I can just add one thing to that. It is absolutely true. This is unprecedented. Watching this horror live is not the kind of thing that happens. Like, this is a completely new way of conveying information. But which countries are going to take them is the logistical challenge that Israel is trying to figure out at this point with the United States. Trump and Netanyahu are trying to figure that out. But the plan is categorically to make life so dire, to make people so desperate that they're eager to escape somewhere. And then Israel will be more than happy to facilitate the exit with money, with whatever it takes. We should just be absolutely clear about the fact that there's nothing voluntary about that. That rhetoric should never be allowed to pass unchallenged. It is still ethnic cleansing. To make people desperate to leave by destroying their lives is ethnic cleansing, and that is precisely what's being proposed. And to just kind of zoom out a little bit, the challenge for Israel for a very long time has been this mantra of, we are a Jewish state, we're a democratic state, and people are pointing to the contradiction, saying you can't be both if you have a Palestinian majority, which is effectively what you have between the river and the sea when you talk about the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and then Palestinian citizens of Israel. And you add on top of that Palestinians in the diaspora who had been driven out. you have a supermajority that Israel is desperate to change. And you had even American politicians like John Kerry using, I think, the word apartheid, saying that is your future if you don't do something about this. And there was a belief for a very long time that Israel's project is unsustainable because once that apartheid becomes impossible to hide anymore, there's going to be a global uprising against it. And Israel is desperate to change that, and they are starting with the 2 million Palestinians left in Gaza right now. But they absolutely have their eyes on the rest of the Palestinian population. And to Phyllis's point, it is about the West Bank and Jerusalem more than it is about Gaza ultimately. Those are the lands that Israel is desperate to hold on to for religious significance, for water resources, for everything else. And what we are witnessing right now is a modern 21st century effort to destroy an entire people and an entire society. And this is a test for the world of whether the values that we preach and the institutions that we've built, whether they mean anything or not. And whether we're going to stand here and watch an entire people and nation and society be destroyed, or whether we're going to do something about it.
And we should note that one of the aspects of the International Court of Justice case that South Africa brought is important for precisely this reason, because genocide requires two things. I think people know this. One is that you need a specific intent to destroy all or part of a specific group, in this case, Palestinians. In the other, you need at least one of 5 separate acts of violence, killing people, injuring people. One of those 5 is creating the conditions that make life impossible. You don't have to kill anybody. You can kill them all, that's genocide, but you don't have to kill even one. If you make the conditions of life so bad that people are forced to leave, and thus the group is destroyed, even if no one is killed. That's the part of the genocide that they are proudly asserting that they are doing. And it's the part that most people don't know about because people think of it in the context of mass killing. Genocide means mass killing. It doesn't necessarily. It can. We've seen that in other genocides. It did in Rwanda, it did in the Holocaust. But it doesn't have to. That's not the requirement. So this question of challenging genocide in all of its ways becomes so crucial to how the world does or chooses not to respond.
Well, I mean, it's all become an issue of semantics. Nobody in the Congress really wants to, I mean, very, very, very few want to say the word genocide, and they think by not saying the word genocide, they're actually able to sort of skirt the issue of international law or war crimes or anything like, well, war crimes are different, but anyway, that's what they're looking for. But I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience. You mentioned earlier about how the movement was so on message about the ceasefire, about ending that. Is it time to shift? Is it time to talk about, like you said, pull it back a little bit and look at the bigger picture and say from the river to the sea? Is it time to really make that the focus for JVP and other organizations that have been leading, I think, a lot of the efforts happening not only in Congress, on the street as well. What should we do now as a movement, if you want to call it that needs to make this massive change that's necessary? And I want to say that by prefacing it, the same question. I had a chance to see Angela Davis and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and they were speaking about activism. This is in Detroit, Michigan, just a couple days ago. And the conversation was just about activism in general. And within 30 seconds, it switched to Palestine and stayed on that topic for the next 2 hours. And one of the and there were 1,000 students of different colors in the audience, very, very engaged, applause every 2 minutes, But anyway, one of the questions was about we're frustrated, we don't know, we keep trying. She said, she kind of put it in perspective. She's 81 years old now, and she's been through so much. And she said, you have to remember that you're here because somebody fought for you that didn't know you, didn't know what's going to happen. So sometimes we do these things, not because we want results tomorrow, and not because, we can get results tomorrow, but this is just toward a a more just world. So having prefaced it with that, I just want to know what is your impression of what needs to happen at this point in the maybe immediate term and long term?
My view on this is a little conservative, not in the like right left sense, but like reserved. I think that there is a lot to talk about in terms of Zionism and from the river to the sea and a million other things. But for me, living in this country, I feel like we should focus on the lowest common denominator, where you can get the widest agreement on a very basic principle that we should all be behind, which is not another dime, not another gun, not another bomb to this genocidal government, period. And the people that you would get to sign on to that, you don't even have to be left, you don't have to be a progressive, you don't have to even care about Palestinians, frankly. There are right-wing libertarians who don't care about Palestine, just care about American money helps Americans, you don't send it abroad. That seems to be a basic elementary demand, that there's no reason, no matter what your political ideology is, that American money should be shipped over in order to assist in the committing of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and now genocide. If it were up to me, I would say that should be the primary and central focus of this movement. Obviously, there are, in terms of a political demand, in terms of tactics, there's many different tactics that you can employ, boycott, divestment, and sanctions on levels beyond just kind of the government advocacy. But for me, the government advocacy of it is we have to get to the point where we don't send money and weapons to countries that are committing severe and grave human rights violations. And the top of that list is the one country that gets more military weapons than any other country on the planet from the United States, and the country that is uniquely being treated like it's a country that is above the law and above the rules. That has to come to an end.
What he said. I think that's absolutely right in terms of what is our demand. I was struck over these months of seeing this extraordinary new version of our movement that has sprung up so spontaneously, that managed, as I said earlier, to both maintain this discipline around the demand for ceasefire while broadening the understanding of that to include stop sending weapons. Stop selling them, stop giving them, just stop. Stop making them. All of that. I think that's a hard one. I think we all should be able to agree on that one. I don't think we all do agree on that one. But yes, I think at the level of the of our advocacy work, not only in Congress where they actually write the checks, but in city councils and all the places where the weapons are made. You know, this is one of the things that comes back to the military-industrial complex. One of the few conspiracies that I actually believe in. I know you believe in conspiracies. I really don't.
I do.
But
I'm Arab.
I know you
We
do.
believe in all conspiracies.
Yeah, Jews do too, but I don't. I'm different. But I will say, there's one conspiracy I really do believe in, and that is, I don't know how it happened, but there's no other excuse for it, that after World War II, all these big corporations that had been suddenly pulled into service to build the weapons to win this war, right? They figured out a way to continue making a killing, in every sense of the word, on weapons production, when we weren't at war with anybody. How did they do that? They did it by determining that the way they were going to produce these weapons was the least efficient way possible. So that you make a little widget somewhere in, somewhere in the middle of Idaho, and they have to then ship those little widgets to somewhere in Massachusetts, where that little widget is put into a bigger widget that then has to be shipped off to Southern California. And the result of all that is that all but two, this was as of a few years ago, it's probably still the same now, all but two congressional districts had at least some jobs in their district that were based on contracts for weapons. So that they were never going to vote against a weapons system because it's not, even if they were against it, because they can't afford to be against jobs in their own community. I don't understand how that could have happened without a conspiracy, but that's just me. But the reality is, it is an intrinsic part of the economy of this country. So how we challenge it is really, really challenging. But one of the things that we're now looking at is we're seeing the immediacy of our bombs being dropped in Gaza. It's our 2,000-pound bombs that are destroying whole city blocks at one time. So that when we're looking now at that footage that that we all see over and over again of absolute devastation, of buildings that are nothing but shells that have collapsed into rubble. The rubble of those buildings, under which there are somewhere in the tens of thousands of children and elders and women and men who were just living their lives. Those people were killed by our bombs, and it's evident because people can pick up the pieces of the bombs that have the US Pentagon numbers on them. So it's not as far of a stretch to talk about that. And that's the challenge that we face. The BDS movement, the movement for boycott and divestment and sanctions, is such a crucial part of this. And it includes sanctioning weapons production and weapons sales. All of this is crucial. The movement against Israeli apartheid is crucial to this. It all culminates in this genocide. And what you said before, Omar, I think is so important, that genocide is different. Genocide is different, and we have to treat it differently. So that for me, living in this country, paying taxes in this country, our obligation is to stop enabling the genocide. That's our job. There will be time to do other things, to fight for freedom for all Palestinians, to have the right of return. Today, I don't think that's even the issue. The issue is to stop enabling a continuing genocide.
And part of the military-industrial complex is, of course, you know, it's the tractors, it's the other stuff that is also used for domestic.
The armored bulldozers that killed Rachel Corrie, that's the same bulldozers that they've just ordered 30 or something more to take out, they say, the rubble. But that means creating more rubble as they do it.
The crowd might be too young for Rachel Corrie.
Sorry. Rachel Corrie, at the age of 23.
Hold on. How many people know what she's talking about when she says Rachel Corrie?
Oh.
It's not that young.
See?
They know. Yeah.
They know. Never mind.
Anyway, we have time for a few questions. So I know that
Andrew.
you were talking about I think earlier, Omar, you were talking about, so to speak, to the conservatives and their interests and so on. I know that, is Medea here? Oh, there she is. I know that Medea and Tig, you were at CPAC recently, and you had a chance to speak to some of those conservatives.
Yeah.
Can you say a few words about what they had to say?
Well, I think there is a major disconnect between what the Republican Party is doing as far as Israel and what a lot of Republicans and MAGA people think, because we had a chance to just randomly have discussions with people, and we found a lot of them being against U.S. sending money to Israel, having sympathy for the Palestinians. And so I think, you know, at the base of Trump's campaigning for peace, it wasn't just about Ukraine, it was also the Middle East. And I do wonder, as a question, how can we reach more of those people?
I think it's a good effort. I have questions about, I've always known people who were against Israel because they're anti-Semites in the real sense, not the weaponized version that we hear from the various definitions, but people who really, yeah. So I think that's a strand of MAGA thought. I don't think it's everybody. I don't think it's the majority necessarily. But I do think that it's a factor, but I'm not sure right now that we can, that's our starting point in a sense, I guess. Because I don't think that we yet have mobilized, we haven't organized people who are progressive, who are centrists, who are not the conservatives, who are not right-wing libertarians necessarily, who might believe that also. I think that there are moments for that we can grab those opportunities to have exactly the kind of conversation that you guys are talking about. But in terms of what is it going to take at the short term to stop this U.S. enabling of genocide, I think it's going to have to be initially some move in Congress. And how we move Congress, we don't know at this point, because what we've seen is that the Democratic Party is not prepared to take up this issue. The Republicans mostly are not. And those on the right wing that are not the ones who have influence on Congress mostly. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think that we have a lot of work to do to reach people we still think are more or less on our side, but we haven't engaged them sufficiently to have the impact that we need. That's still the challenge.
If I can add something small to this too. Look, there's a big split between public opinion and policy on many, many different issues. The majority of Americans want action on climate change. Our politicians are dragging their feet and slow to challenge the big oil, basically, to do something about it. The same with Medicare for all, the same with so many things in which public opinion is decidedly on one side, and the political establishment is on the other side of it. So the public education bit of this is really, really important. And I think I'm of the opinion that let 1,000 flowers bloom just everywhere that you can do public education, every space that we can possibly be in, letting people know the truth about what's going on is a place that we should be at and should be speaking. But then there's also the question of where you can have that political leverage ultimately to get a change in policy. And I agree with the point that if we're talking about moving Congress, when you think of Bernie Sanders, when you think of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and sort of the squad, and we're just a little bit closer on the progressive end. And so I see a reason to be focused on the progressive end of the spectrum in terms of the political advocacy bit, without ever dismissing the idea that we should be speaking to everyone everywhere, because this is a cause of fundamental decency and humanity that people of all walks of life should be able to get.
Do you have, is there an effort to get like 535 copies of this book in Congress?
We haven't figured out a plan to do that. If there was somebody who wanted to donate the
Well,
cost of it
People
to
can help with that. If each
yeah.
person maybe
Buy an
buys
extra copy.
2 or 3 books, we can all go together and distribute them and leave them at each congressman's
Yeah.
office and senators.
yeah, I think we do know that members of Congress tend to not read very much. So
Well, it's
They're
not
staffers.
It's not
Yeah.
them. It's
But
their,
to their
it's
staff.
it's
To their staff,
staffers.
exactly.
They're
Yeah.
staffers, and it's
Yeah.
the thing I like about this book is not like you have to sit and read it in one sitting. It's questions, right? So if they ever wonder, like, who is Hamas? They can actually, be able to.
it's really designed for that, to be able to look
So I
up
think-
questions.
I think it's a
yeah.
perfect book for staffers.
That's a good idea.
So we should do it.
That's a good idea.
Yep. 535, and you should make it a thing.
Half price? The publisher would give them to us for half price, I'm sure.
If you give
So it'd be
them half
$10
price-
a piece, so.
Listen, I will buy them personally and distribute them, okay? I will buy them right here, San Jose State. I will buy them and we'll get, I can't personally go take them to 535 people, but I'm sure we can get enough people to help with that. Right, Medea? We get people to help.
We're committing you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great.
All right, we got that. Yes. Yeah, we need to do this, okay? So we'll do this right after. I'm sorry?
The staffers.
Absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll even wear a suit that day. Yeah. You should come. I think you guys are authors, so you should be part of it. All right, we have Andrew. Do you want to say something, please? And then we'll go to the back.
Thank you for this book, Phyllis, very much.
Hold it closer.
Can you hear me now? Thank you so much for this book. I know how close you were to Edward Said and how much he influenced you and worked with you, and I know he, would have, been very pleased that you were doing this. And I wanted to ask you, how much does he, or do you think he does? How much can you hear me?
You're sounding a little bit garbled. If you can hold the microphone.
I'll hold it like this. I'm sorry. I don't usually use microphones to speak. The extent to which what writing helped shape your thought. You mentioned this earlier on, how the discourse has changed, and I was thinking, his book, The Question of Palestine, which was published in 1978. I'm putting together a collection of his works now. I'm trying to figure out what works of his to publish. And he describes the Palestinians as the victims of the victims. Well, the victims, the people who are carrying this out are not victims, they're perpetrators. So the way, what framework allows us to better understand this? And what did you, it was a challenge to write, I'm sure,
It's a big question. I guess there's two things I would say in terms of the first part of your question, which was Edward's influence on me. One was after reading his seminal work, Orientalism, which I struggled through for a whole summer. It took me a whole summer to read it. It's a really difficult book to read. I was not a graduate student. I was like sort of really struggling. And when I finished it, I was furious with this man I had never met and never expected to meet, because I realized that it was brilliant, that it was this whole new idea I had never really thought of, but it was so difficult. It was so not accessible that I kind of raged to myself, why didn't he write something that more people could read? This is nuts. And about a year later, he published The Question of Palestine and Covering Islam. The two were the sort of popular versions. I mean, given Edward, they weren't exactly popular, but I mean, in the sense of easy, but they were at least understandable. So that was one part, for me, it was the first time I ever really thought about the need to reach people, not only in the context of academic literature. So that was one part of it. The other part really was not about his writing as much as it was about his understanding of organizing. In the last year or 2 years of his life, he worked really closely with us as we were creating what's now called the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. It had a different name earlier. And it was really Edward who challenged us in a way that was very different at that moment to say the focus needs to be on the U.S., on the U.S. government, not this running around protesting at the Israeli embassy all the time, which is what most of us were doing at the time. He said, the Israelis don't care what you people think, whoever you are. They care about what the U.S. allows them to do and pays them to do and arms them to do. You need to keep the focus on the U.S. And now that seems obvious for all of us. But at the time, this was in the around in the late 90s, I guess, that we were having these discussions. And then the campaign was created in 2001. And that was kind of a new idea at the time, to keep the focus primarily on the U.S. So I've always been grateful to Edward, the conversations that I had with him. And then one other time when he wanted me to do something when he was getting quite ill and he wasn't able to do it, to meet with some people. And I said, Edward, I can't do that. You need a Palestinian to do that. And he looked at me and he said, Phyllis, don't get ethnic on me, which I always sort of appreciated just as a little bit of a challenge to, I don't know what, but I was like that.
His picture is on the wall over there, on the mural. It was signed by his daughter a few years later.
Also want to be aware that we have another event after this one, so we're going to maybe try to do 2 questions at a time, if that's okay.
Thank you. Linda Pence-Gunter, I have a question. You mentioned influencing Congress, and presumably the best way to influence Congress is from their voters, and they need to hear from their voters because what they care about is staying in office. And what struck me, and I'm interested to know what your view is of why this is the case, but what struck me is the lack of turnout to protest in this country, other than the great student encampments. I'm originally from the UK, and there's been a demonstration every month in the UK since October the 7th in London of 200,000 people, 300,000 people, 500,000 people. The same in other cities around the country, every single month. In Manchester, UK, there's a protest every Saturday with thousands of people in the street. We haven't seen that here. Netanyahu came here, Gallant came here. There were, a couple of thousand of us downtown protesting that. Where is everybody? So what's happened here that has created this lethargy of not being outraged by a genocide that we're watching unfold in front of our eyes. I mean, I can't think of any other bigger reason than to go out and protest, and yet nobody's there. I mean, not nobody, but by contrast, the UK, minimal amounts of people. So what's it going to take to get people to let their members of Congress know that we don't accept this? You know, you're not going to stay elected if you don't do this. The uncommitted movement was great. I was part of that in the primaries. But at the end of the day, yeah, we were faced with this Faustian bargain. You know, what do we do? Lesser of two evils. So I'm curious to know what you think could change, because that's what needs to change.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree with your premise. I think there have been protests all over the country. They've not all been big. Most of them have not been very big, but they have been, many of them are consistent. There are protests going on all over the place. I think that the question of Congress is a complicated one because, yes, members of Congress want to stay in their jobs. But they also believe, because it's been proven true in this country for many years, that the way you get to stay in your job is by raising money, not by doing what your voters necessarily want. And that's a huge challenge for us. It's a huge problem. Because our mobilizations are mostly not about raising money for candidates. It's about putting people in the streets, it's about putting people in the suites, it's about sitting in, it's about all those things. I think that part of the reason that we're seeing less people in the streets now on Palestine is two things. One is people are in the streets around what is happening to our government, what is happening to the social safety net in this country. So that the protests outside of the Treasury building, outside of, all of this, people are in the streets protesting. It's quite powerful. But it's also true that in those early months where the protests were huge, we saw the biggest protest on Palestine that had ever happened in this country, 400,000 people in the streets of Washington. That had never happened before. It has happened in the UK, it had never happened here. So that was a huge step forward. What's also true is that all of these creative tactics that we used for those months were not enough. And we haven't come up with an idea of what is going to be enough. People in any country don't come out and don't come out and protest when they don't think that their protest is going to lead to change. And right now, that's the position we're in. Most of our protests are not leading to change. We need to figure out something different. I don't know that it's necessarily different tactics, it's different strategies. What's our strategic approach that links the question of genocide with the question of rising fascism in this country? How do we make those links? I don't think we've done that sufficiently yet, but that's what I think we need.
I think one other reason might also be that all of this started kind of close to the elections that were kind of taking place, and the candidates and the whole idea of if you don't support this candidate, you end up with Trump. And I think a lot of people were kind of hesitant about sticking their neck out and going full throttle against the current administration that was then talking about ending the genocide and kind of pinning that on them, which obviously they're responsible for. So I think there was this hesitation, and the progressive movement was very divided. There were some people that thought maybe we should be a little quiet, let this pass through and let it get the election done, etc. And other people were feeling maybe a little differently, because at the beginning there were a lot of people out on the street. And I think it just, once the election started to take shape, the narrative started to sort of control the type of demonstrations going on, who was showing up at those demonstrations. I think people were afraid of Trump, and that became the kind of the wet blanket on many of the demonstrations.
The one other thing I would add is just that I think it's not easy, but it's easier to mobilize people to protest than it is to organize people into ongoing strategic campaigns. That's much harder, and we have not done enough of that.
And I think we can do 2 more back-to-back, maybe 3.
I think we have to take 3. Well, who really wants to ask a question?
We'll start back here.
Okay, let's do four. Let's do four more.
Hi. So we're actually visiting from Canada, and everything that you've said kind of mirrors where we are in terms of the building a strategic mobilization instead of just like individual protests. From your experience, like as looking around, I think more like senior people than young, which is refreshing to see. Same in Vancouver, where we're from. In other movements, like let's say Vietnam, let's say Afghanistan, Iraq, what have been successful tactics that could be mirrored to actually build continuous momentum? And how do we kind of, again, the narrative that you talk about, how do we have the narrative centered around first ending the genocide and B, like the right to return, Palestinian autonomy and all that?
And then we had someone near the front, I think.
All right. I just want to make an announcement that I've been lobbying with Doctors Against Genocide, speaking of an ongoing campaign. They go every month for about a year. And we're developing relationships with staff members and deepening them, and they're very powerful and very effective. And come on March 12th, we can distribute the books. If you want to show up on March 12th is the next one. So I want to highly encourage that. And I'm also organizing psychologists and maybe some other groups to join them.
I did see someone right here who caught my attention first.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. The first one is, I wasn't here from the get-go, so excuse me if I missed something. You stated that we are enabling a genocide, and I personally would disagree and say we are part of the genocide. And I'm curious as to why you believe we're enabling a genocide instead of this is our genocide. And then the second question is regarding strategic mobilization. And if our goal is to mobilize to create momentum as opposed to just being active, could there be an organization that's set up where we're actually targeting AIPAC because they are influencing and buying our members of Congress? And could part of that be an organization that actually helps fundraise as well as promote new members of Congress on a lower level, governmental level, to try to push them through and to help them rise in the ranks? Thank you.
I think we have enough to get started here, and then.
Okay, sorry about that.
Well, this is a lot of questions. On the last one about Congress, there are most of the Palestine-specific organizations in the last 2 or 3 years have created fundraising arms of various sorts to do exactly that work. And there's groups like Justice Democrats that are putting significant amount of money as a PAC into finding candidates who are directly more progressive on Palestine and on other key issues. So some of that is already underway. Is it enough? Of course not. Does there need to be more? Sure. But it's not as if that doesn't exist. It does. There's a number of organizations already doing that have C4 organizations. So that's, I think, part of it. I think it would be a mistake for us to think we could ever match the fundraising ability of major lobby organizations, of which AIPAC is not the only one. The Christian Zionist organizations have enormous financial resources as well. So I think there's, that's a big challenge. I think our organizing is more important, in fact, is where we can challenge much more fully than we can at the financial level. On the question of Vietnam and Iraq, I don't think that our movements were very important in those days. I've always fought against the view that says that the anti-war movement ended the war. The Vietnamese won the war. That was why that war ended. It wasn't that it wasn't because we were better organized than we are now around Palestine, for instance. We were, but that's not why the war ended. It was because, if we look at recent history, the last 30, 40 years, the victors, where there has been military struggle, has been pretty much across the board, the militarily weaker side is who won. And it's because people are fighting for something more than, in the case of Vietnam, the issue of the draft was a huge component both in mobilizing young people to oppose it and in why it didn't, why the fighters were not fighting for something they necessarily believed in, why there was such opposition to the war within the military. That was a huge component of it. So I think there are important lessons, but part of it is difficult because we're in such a different political moment. In the Vietnam War, this was in the era of decolonization all over the world. And like in other situations, we had a movement in this country where people at the core of that movement supported the other side overtly, not militarily or financially, but politically, to recognize the legitimacy of North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front's efforts to fight for to get the colonial powers, whether it was France or China or Japan or the US, out of their country. And then there was a much broader movement that was fighting for bring the troops home, stop fighting. So we have some similarities, but this isn't an era where that kind of anti-colonial struggle is going on all over the world, where there are strategic allies in neighboring countries, that sort of thing. It's just not. So things are very, very different. So I think there's probably some lessons, but I don't think it's that we can just apply those exact things. Do you want to jump in on some of this?
Sure. I mean, I'll jump in on the Iraq bit, which is when my sort of activism was also beginning here in the US. To say we've mobilized the biggest demonstrations in the history of the world in February of 2003, but we failed to stop that invasion. And public opinion, because of mass media in this country, supported it initially and did not turn against it until it became, quote unquote, a quagmire for the US. So even though at this point we have significant recognition that Iraq was a mistake, it's viewed not as a mistake at the expense of the Iraqi people, but a mistake because, well, the US, did not get the outcomes that it wanted, and we lost too many troops. So I don't look back at that and say we've had a great success that we have to learn from. I look at that and say we should examine that more closely to see how we can improve, what mistakes we can learn from our failures there to see how we can succeed in the future. So it's a difficult one.
But let me just say one thing on that one before you go to the next, which is that I think one of the lessons that I think was most visible around the Iraq protests was that what we thought at the time was a failure was not a failure. We did fail to stop that invasion, but we achieved other things that we could not have known at the time, including stopping or preventing a war against Iran, which almost happened in 2007. And a number of other things like that were the direct result of that global mobilization in February of 2003. So we also need to rethink how we assess our own work,
Yeah, sometimes victories are not decisive in the big outcome that you see immediately, but in the way that you shift the conversation that could prevent further harm.
The other part, of course, is to the military-industrial complex, it was a huge success. I mean, if we're talking in those terms, like in Afghanistan, we were there for 20 years, and they said, oh, it was such a miserable failure, but a lot of people got really wealthy. So for some people, it was totally a success. So sometimes we kind of count failures from our perspective, where it seems like a very different outcome on the other side. I want to ask sort of one last kind of comment and say, if the bombs start falling tomorrow on Gaza, do you think there will be, what needs to happen on the streets, what needs to happen in Congress, what needs to happen, what should people be focused on if that occurs, or is it just going to be, oh well, we thought it was going to happen anyway, and kind of move on?
About a week ago, there was a full-page ad in the New York Times signed off by 350 rabbis and another 50 or so kind of well-known Jews of various sorts. Who knew that Joaquin Phoenix was Jewish? I never knew that. It was kind of amazing. And it was a very simple thing. It said, I forget what it was one sentence describing what Trump says he wants, that he wants ethnic cleansing. and that he wants to remove all Palestinians from Gaza. And then it says, Jews say no to ethnic cleansing. Just that. And these hundreds of names of rabbis. That was astonishing. Nothing like that has ever happened before. Now, did it stop anything by itself? Of course not. No one thing ever does. But was it a piece of evidence of how the discourse is shifting? Absolutely. So I think that we're going to need to do all those things. If the ceasefire, we didn't talk about the ceasefire, if it collapses, which is quite likely, and the bombing starts again, yes, there will be, and they must be supported, protests in the streets. There will be sit-ins in Congress. We will need to have serious conversations with those who we think of as our champions in Congress on this issue, that they cannot afford to leave this behind because of what Trump is doing day by day, hour by hour to destroy our country, that we have to do both. That's going to be the challenge.
The one thing, I'll just add one last thing on this, is there's reasons, right, tempting to feel despair, having not been able to stop a genocide for 16 months straight, and the possibility of it renewing once more with an administration that is less susceptible to public pressure. And frankly, the chaos that Trump creates in our discourse makes it hard to focus on any one particular issue. But I think that there is something promising about our ability to do things a little bit differently. Two things. One is that now that Donald Trump has made his, the pretense before, when Biden was president, is, oh, Israel's targeting Hamas and it's by accident they're killing civilians, and are they killing too many? There's the pretense among progressives that this is complicated. And when Trump says the goal is ethnic cleansing and Israel acts on it, there's not going to be any complication about it. Progressives can finally unite and turn out and be a joint force together to do something about this. And more importantly, the national media, a good section of it, that has been terrified to criticize a Democratic administration leading up to an election, is not going to have any qualms about calling out this project of genocide and ethnic cleansing that Trump is endorsing. And we can gain some power and strength from that and do what needs to be done to actually put an end to it.
All right, thank you
Every
so much.
protest matters.
Thank you, Omar Baddar. Thank you, Phyllis Bennis. Are we going to do the signing in
Yes,
the other room?
we're going to be doing the signing in the bookstore.
We're going to do the signing
yeah.
in the bookstore, and please don't forget to buy your book here. It's a great book, and it's a gift you can give to somebody. So they're going to go, and they're going to be over there by the bookstore counter. So please go there to get the book. Thank you so much.